Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And in many fictional universes, plenty of villains would seek to rule that world just as they seek to rule everything around them. It's probably one of the most generic motivations for any villain. They don't just want to defeat the hero, they want to rule the entire world. Now how they go about it, why they want to do it, and how capable they are in their efforts, that all varies wildly. And even villains who don't seek to rule the world still seek power on some level. Whether it's the power to right some egregious wrong, the power to remake the world in their image, or just power for the sake of their own inflated ego. It used to be such a common goal that it was often cliched. Any villain that sought to rule was rarely seen as compelling or complex. Wanting to rule the world, the galaxy, or even the entire universe just seemed like a cookie-cutter motivation for an overly typical villain. But recently, I feel like this standard motivation has become more complicated in recent years, mostly because of issues that are unfolding in the real world. More and more these days, people are aware of just how inept, incompetent, and self-serving rulers tend to be. It doesn't matter if they're a prototypical monarch or a democratically elected official. It's really not hard to find instances of them being corrupt, callous, or just plain stupid. As a result, villains who seek to rule have gained greater scrutiny. The idea of anyone wanting to overthrow or somehow disrupt the current order of things, it actually has a certain appeal on some levels. It's also something that heroes just can't usually do, now without becoming villains themselves. And while that concept certainly has some complexities to it, that's not what I want to focus on here. For this video, I want to highlight two prominent villains for whom ruling is a major motivation. Dr. Doom from Marvel Comics and Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars. These two are among the most iconic villains of all time, and while ruling is often at the forefront of their respective agendas, they're also very different in terms of background and narrative. And those differences are worth highlighting because it informs us how they go about ruling. When it comes to villains who are just pure, unmitigated evil, Shiv Palpatine is the gold standard who sets the highest of bars. From his own personal origins to how the vast narrative of Star Wars unfolds, Palpatine's personality and goals have always been very simple. He's just plain evil through and through. He knows he's evil. He chooses to be evil. He likes being evil. There's nothing that made him this way. No one drove him into evil or villainy. He was just born into the Star Wars universe as this sinister, malevolent force. And being so evil, his primary goals have always revolved around seeking power, authority, and dominance over others. Becoming a powerful Sith Lord was just a means to an end. But even if he wasn't a Sith, even if he had no access to the Force at all, his underlying motivations probably wouldn't change. And while the story of how Palpatine came to power is an epic feat that spanned multiple movies and TV shows, there's never been any ambiguity when it comes to how he wields that power. He is a tyrant by every meaningful standard. He has no higher ideals. He has no grand vision for his followers or supporters. Emperor Palpatine rules the galaxy as an exercise of power, ego, and authority. He sees every living being in the galaxy as little more than pawns, tools for him to use as he sees fit. And every planet and parsec of galactic space, these are all just his resources to exploit. Anyone or anything that gets in his way, he destroys without mercy. And any act or any policy that gains him greater power, he does it without hesitation or remorse. The well-being of those under his rule is very low on his list of priorities. And if others suffer under Emperor Palpatine's rule, regardless of whether or not they're a threat to him in any way, it does not bother him in the slightest. Palpatine is, in essence, the ultimate tyrant, the true personification of a cruel, megalomaniacal ruler. How he goes about inflicting his tyranny may change given the circumstances and conflicts he deals with, but his goals and his style are a galactic constant. If you happen to find yourself under Palpatine's rule, your entire existence hinges upon his evil whims. You really can't expect much in terms of freedom or prosperity beyond what he personally allows. But you can expect order. You can expect simplicity with respect to the overarching power structure. And if you pose no real threat to Emperor Palpatine, then he really doesn't care about you, at least until he needs someone on which to use his power. But if you dare rebel, you can expect no compromise and no mercy. On the surface, Victor Von Doom has the poise, demeanor, and ego of a pure evil villain. And while Doom has committed more than his share of evil acts throughout his history, he is a much more complex character, and at times, the nature of his villainy isn't overtly evil. In the early days of the Fantastic Four, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby presented Doom as a different kind of villain. He was not born into wealth and privilege like Shiv Palpatine. In fact, Doom and his family were often targets of repression by the brutal monarchs of his home country, Latveria. So, he more than most knows what it's like to endure poverty, hunger, loss, and oppression. But Victor Von Doom was also born with immense skill, both mentally and physically. And he put that skill to use, mastering both magic and technology. And throughout his history, he has carried out some truly incredible feats with those skills. From taking on Mephisto in his own realm to actually becoming a capital G god at one point during Secret Wars. But when it comes to ruling, Dr. Doom's approach is simple but nuanced. Doom's word is law, Doom's wisdom is absolute, and Doom's capabilities are unmatched. Now, this method might seem akin to that of a tyrant, but this is where some of the complexities enter the picture. Because, villain or not, Dr. Doom genuinely does care about the well-being of his people. Yes, it matters that they fear him as their ruler, so long as that is all that they fear. And thanks to Doom's mastery of science and magic, his people don't really want for anything. They don't fear poverty, illness, or uncertainty, and running the entire country under his absolute rule is no great challenge for him either. Between his brilliant mind and his army of Doombots, Doom can both enforce his will and provide for the material well-being of his people. And even though plenty do fear him, most Latverians love their ruler. Even if he is an absolute monarch, living under him doesn't seem to feel like tyranny, unless, of course, you do something to oppose or upset Doom. That being said, Dr. Doom does have a nasty habit of making misguided decisions out of ego. He also has a tendency to undermine his own rule to achieve something beyond the well-being of his citizens, usually in a plot to defeat the Avengers or the Fantastic Four. He's even willingly made deals with Mephisto that have led his people to hate him. These are all acts that make him a menacing villain, but also negatively impact his ability to lead and to rule. Even so, there are many within the Marvel Universe that acknowledge that Dr. Doom is a great leader. And at one point, the Panther god Bast says outright that the only future in which humanity is free from want and suffering is a future in which Dr. Doom rules. That further complicates just how evil his goals truly are, but those complications don't undermine his capabilities as a ruler. Having established their respective styles as rulers, let's take a moment to highlight the major contrast between Dr. Doom and Emperor Palpatine. Beyond their different backgrounds, they each took different paths to achieving power. Shiv Palpatine was careful, cunning, and patient, skillfully manipulating his way throughout the halls of power in the Galactic Republic. At times, he painted himself as a solution to the many problems that the galaxy faced, even acting as a champion of the Republic before eventually destroying it. Dr. Doom, on the other hand, was a lot more blunt in his approach. Once he gained his iconic suit of armor, he led a rebellion within Latveria, enlisting fanatical followers of common citizens. And thanks to his mastery of science and sorcery, the barons of Latveria didn't really stand a chance. Doom actually murdered the last baron with his bare hands before declaring himself ruler. And the people cheered him on. And once they were in power, Dr. Doom and Emperor Palpatine ruled with similar principles. Their word was law, their authority was absolute. At times they may employ minions, underlings, and regional governors, but the authority of those individuals only exists at the pleasure of them, the true rulers. And if at any point they become a threat or cease to be useful, neither Doom nor Palpatine hesitates to cast them aside. They also don't mind being cruel or ruthless about it. Throughout both the main and prequel trilogies, Emperor Palpatine has shown a callous disregard for allies and apprentices alike. He even commanded that Anakin kill Dooku, who had served as a loyal apprentice throughout the Clone Wars. And as soon as the Trade Federation ceased being useful, he didn't mind slaughtering them either. Dr. Doom can be just as ruthless. While he rarely allies himself with others, he can be quite cruel and manipulative in his own right. In one iconic story, aptly titled Unthinkable, Doom reconnects with his childhood love Valeria, only to sacrifice her to a group of demons in exchange for greater mystical powers. But where these two often stand apart often comes down to their tactics. Whereas Palpatine will often remain behind the scenes, content to let others do his bidding, Dr. Doom tends to be a lot more hands-on. And even when he does so through a Doombot, he only ever trusts himself to get the job done. Palpatine will still fight when he has to, but he tends to prefer sticking to his plan, exercising restraint when needed and using his power wisely. There's also a significant difference in terms of the scale in which they rule. Because Emperor Palpatine rules over an entire galaxy of many planets, species, and systems. He also manages vast armies of various weapons, troops, and projects. And when you consider big projects like the Death Star, it's very clear where Palpatine's priorities lie with respect to resource management. With Dr. Doom, he primarily only rules Latveria for the most part. And while there have been timelines where he does successfully conquer the world, the universe, and the multiverse, his dominion has primarily been restricted to one small country. Even though he rules that country exceptionally well, his agendas as a man and as a ruler tend to be divided. For him, ruling the world and defeating Reed Richards are equally important. But with Palpatine, simply furthering his power is his primary goal, and killing the entire Jedi Order was a way of achieving that goal. Now, there are many other distinctions between the two. Their methods and priorities may differ, but their respective endgames are similar. They both seek to further their power and their rule, crush any and all rivals, and exercise their own personal vanity. That's what makes them villains. But in terms of the actual results of their rule, that's where other distinctions emerge. Regardless of how evil, ruthless, or powerful a ruler might be, in the end, that ruler will be judged by how effective they ultimately are. Now that's not easy to measure, especially within fictional settings that include magic, Death Stars, Doombots, and Ewoks. You can't just look at Dr. Doom and Emperor Palpatine and say one was better because of their economic numbers. So for villainous characters like this, we have to use other metrics. Now in terms of securing their power, Doom and Palpatine are fairly similar. Once they became rulers of their respected domains, they were swift in making clear that their authority was absolute. But in doing so, they did incur some opposition. Emperor Palpatine dealt with the Rebel Alliance in some form or another for the entire duration of his reign. And while Dr. Doom has frequently faced opposition on many fronts, it rarely comes from inside Latveria. Most of the conflicts he faces are when he seeks to conquer the rest of the world, which often incurs the ire of the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. But with respect to managing rebellions, you could still make the case that Emperor Palpatine was more effective. Even though he couldn't stop the rebellion from getting organized, he did manage to outwit, outpower, and overwhelm them for decades. The only reason he failed was because he could not turn Luke Skywalker to the dark side. Yes, it was a big failure that ultimately ended his reign, but prior to that, his ability to rule was quite resilient. Even if you factor in the events of TV shows like Star Wars Rebels or the Clone Wars, Palpatine does have a winning record. By contrast, Dr. Doom's record against the Avengers and the Fantastic Four is not great. Despite his overwhelming abilities and power, he constantly falls short when he goes up against them. On more than one occasion, he has had absolute power within his grasp, only to lose it at the last minute, often thanks to a trick by Reed Richards or a gross oversight on his part. Because of these failures, Dr. Doom has lost control of Latveria on more than one occasion. Even though he eventually returns, his frequent failures against his rivals ensure his rule is chaotic at best. However, if we're measuring effectiveness by how much the people support their ruler, you could certainly make the case that Dr. Doom is better overall. Despite many outside corrupting influences, including the likes of Mephisto, the people of Latveria genuinely love Doom. They don't just praise him because he demands it. Doom actually earns it, because remember, he genuinely cares about its people. And in some stories, he has helped Latveria become a political, diplomatic, and economic powerhouse. And whenever he's gone for any number of reasons, the people of Latveria mourn and yearn for what he brought to their land. By contrast, when Emperor Palpatine was slain in Return of the Jedi, there weren't too many systems mourning him. In fact, there were these big, celebratory parades on multiple planets, cheering joyously at the death of a tyrant. That's because Palpatine never did anything to endear himself to the people, largely because he never cared about them in the first place. He only ever cared about furthering his own power. On top of that, Palpatine dedicated a lot of the galaxy's resources on things like Death Stars and weapons. it really is hard to see how much his rule benefited the average galactic citizen. Unless you were a Moff or a defense contractor, life didn't seem to improve. In addition, Palpatine never went out of his way to establish robust institutions to ensure that his empire continued. And in both the sequel trilogy and the defunct Legends timeline, Palpatine sought to gain so much power that he became functionally immortal, hoping to rule the galaxy forever as an immortal God King. But in both timelines, Palpatine never succeeded. But in some instances, Dr. Doom has. In stories like Secret Wars, Doom has achieved God-level power, and he used that power to rule over the multiverse. But even in later stories when his rule is undone, he flat out says that being a god on that level was beneath him. So, in the grand scheme of things, we could make the case that living under Dr. Doom's rule is preferable to living under Emperor Palpatine's rule, at least for the average person. In both cases, you still have to respect and revere their authority. But only one shows the capacity to genuinely care about those that he rules. The other just sees you as a means to their own selfish end. But at the same time, one was able to outwit the entire Jedi Order and an armed rebellion for decades. The other will undermine everything and everyone over a petty rivalry with his college roommate. Now, however effective they might be, Emperor Palpatine and Dr. Doom have their share of flaws, both as rulers and as villains. And those flaws were enough to ultimately thwart their plans for total domination. In the end, it's largely a matter of how much or how little being an effective ruler meshed with their larger plans. Dr. Doom and Emperor Palpatine are both great characters. There's a reason they're often cited as some of the greatest villains of all time. Being rulers and aspiring to take over their respective domains is only part of their villainous persona. But just wanting to rule the world or rule the galaxy isn't in and of itself a crime. It's not even evil on the surface. If someone thinks they can do a better job of ruling society than the current system, then that surely doesn't make them a villain by default. In some respects, that makes them bold, even noble on some levels. But neither Dr. Doom nor Emperor Palpatine have ever entertained noble intentions. Ruling over others is very much a means to an end, an exercise of the power that they've seized and a manifestation of their own ambition. Both are self-serving in their pursuit of such power, but both are very different with respect to methods, priorities, and tactics. And for those living under these rulers, the experience certainly does vary. Dr. Doom may care about the well-being of the citizens of Latveria, but not enough to pass up an opportunity to prove his superiority over Reed Richards. Emperor Palpatine may see the whole galaxy as one big collection of pawns for him to exploit, but he has also said outright that he doesn't seek to rule over a galaxy of corpses. Even someone as pure evil as him needs to rule in a manner that's effective and organized to some extent. It may not be wholly pleasant for anyone living under them in the long run, but it's also telling that, despite their capabilities as rulers, neither Dr. Doom nor Emperor Palpatine have ever succeeded in the long term. To rule the world or the galaxy effectively requires more than just power or will. There's a certain perspective and vision that every ruler needs to ensure that they succeed. And villains like Dr. Doom and Emperor Palpatine just aren't capable of that. If they were, then they wouldn't even be villains. And if they're not villains, would they even endeavor to rule in the first place? It's hard to say, but that's what makes the stories surrounding them so compelling. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.